So you just started playing Final Fantasy XIV or you're about to start playing, but you're not quite sure yet which role is the right one to pick. Well, fear no longer. In this video we're going to go over the roles in Final Fantasy XIV. I will explain some of their positives, some of their negatives, so that you can then decide for yourself which role might be best suited for you. Alright, I think that's enough, let's get right into it. First up, we're going to talk about the tank role. What makes it different from other roles is that tanks have higher HP and higher defenses, of course. This is due to the nature of the role in the game and their responsibilities that we'll talk about now. The main responsibility you will face as a tank is to be the one at the top of the aggro list. This is important because mobs in dungeons or bosses in big boss fights might otherwise kill your DPS or healers if they are targeted with certain abilities. This means your number one priority is to always be on the lookout that you make sure that you have aggro of everything that's currently visible on the screen basically, or that is attacking you or your party. Besides keeping the aggro of these mobs or these bosses, another responsibility of you is to actually also use your cooldowns. Cooldowns basically increase your defensive stats for a certain amount of time and make it easier to tank bigger hits from opponents. This is very important because sometimes your healer might not be able to keep up with the damage that is outgoing, or some of the tank hits might just be so big that they might even kill you if you don't use a cooldown. So it is very important to remember that you have the responsibility of tanking the aggro of the mobs. Now, the thing is, your responsibilities don't really end there. There are a few more that are more underlying to the tank class. For example, if you're running a dungeon with a party, you are the one who is going ahead. You are basically deciding the pace of the dungeon. You are going to be the one that is the leader of the group. The reason for that is because obviously neither your healer nor your DPS want to grab aggro of mobs ahead of you. This means that a normal formation in a party dungeon would be the tank ahead of the line while everyone else will follow them. This means you decide the pace and you need to be aware of what's going on. On top of that, it is also your responsibility to move the boss or not move it depending on the situation. If there's for example an attack that covers half of the screen, you might have to move the boss into a safe area so that your DPS and healers can follow you and also keep uptime on the boss and keep attacking it. Most importantly, you should always keep the boss still though, so that your melee DPS can always hit their positionals and don't need to run after you while you're tanking a big boss fight. While all these responsibilities may sound a bit intimidating, I do believe the tank role is also perfectly suited for a beginner. Reason being is that you can solely focus on those tasks, and if you do them properly, no one will have a problem with you. Even if you don't know the exact way in a dungeon or you don't know how fast to go, you can easily communicate with your healer or your DPS to know what they look for basically. There's also of course other guides outside of the game in which you can find a certain way of a dungeon or something along those lines. On top of that, I also believe the community in Final Fantasy XIV is very friendly towards new players. It is very clear if you're a new player because you will have a certain icon next to your name, and I do believe that people will treat you differently if they know you're a new player, and they will be overall nicer to you. Aside from these responsibilities, the tank class or tank role doesn't really have a lot more you need to do at the start of the game. Yes, you should obviously press some buttons to do a bit of damage because you need to do damage in order to keep your aggro, but otherwise, honestly, the class is straightforward. On top of that, the tank class has something that the DPS class cannot talk about, and that is the biggest positive I can offer you: very short queue time. The healer in Final Fantasy XIV has, just like in every other MMO, the same role here: to heal basically. You are the part of your party that takes care of the people that cannot dodge proper AoEs, the ones that get hit by more than should. You are the one that heals them, you are the one that takes care of them. So if you enjoy taking care of your party members that might be a bit careless, this is definitely the role for you. On top of that, you can of course also give people some shields, remove negative effects and other things, like for example, raise someone that actually died somewhere. So the healer has actually a lot of power in a party in Final Fantasy XIV. When it comes to responsibilities, the healer really only has what I just talked about. You have to keep everyone healed. You have to make sure your tank doesn't die if he's taking a lot of mobs in the dungeon run, or if he's taking a tank buster in some bigger fight. Besides that, once everyone is healed up and you feel comfortable, you can choose to add with some damage. But honestly, that's something that is for later in the game. When you start out, you don't really need to think that much about doing damage. Of course, it is nice to already get used to it, but it's not something that someone will look at and go like, whoa, why is this healer not doing any damage? No, your most important responsibility is to keep everyone alive. The same that I mentioned earlier for tanks also applies here to healers. They have barely any queue times, and that is honestly amazing. Sometimes as a DPS, you have a queue time of over 15-20 minutes depending on what duty you want to enter. But as a healer or a tank, as earlier said, you will have barely any queue times. There are not enough healers in this game, not enough people choosing to play healer, so maybe this is another opportunity or argument that convinces you that healer might be your thing. Lastly, we cannot forget to talk about the DPS classes. We have melee DPS, range DPS, and magical range DPS. First up, the melee DPS. I personally believe the melee DPS are out of the DPS classes the hardest to play because they have to care about their uptime on the boss to stay in melee range, and they also have positionals. This means sometimes you have to attack from the rear and sometimes from the flank. This means that you actually have to pay attention to how the boss is positioned, how it is turned, to make sure you get the most out of your damage. Now, of course, your number one role as a DPS overall is to simply dish out damage and nothing else. That is very straightforward and quite easy in a way, because no one will see if you fail at doing so. This means that your responsibility is not very obvious to other players in your party, unlike for a tank or a healer. As a DPS, you can afford to not do as much sometimes, because no one will see it anyway and no one will tell you off about it, basically. This does not mean that I encourage not doing anything. I'm just saying that if you're someone who's afraid of responsibilities, the DPS role might be the most suitable for you, even if in my opinion, especially at endgame, the DPS role becomes much harder because there's so many out there, and if you want to be part of a decent group, you have to also play better than all these others basically. If melee DPS sounds a bit too exhausting to play with all the positionals and the uptime, ranged physical DPS might be your thing. You don't have to care about uptime, you don't have to care about staying close to the boss, you don't have to care about positionals, you just press your buttons when they light up or when they are available basically. It's in my opinion very easy to play, the rotations aren't as hard as from other classes, and overall it's still very fun because you have free movement. As a ranged DPS, you might later on in heavier raids get some duties for stacking for some certain markers or something along those lines because you are the one that has the least restrictions out of all DPS. If physical range DPS sounds a bit too lame for you, I might have a solution for you with the magical range DPS. Those are of course very similar to the physical range DPS with the difference that they are casters. That means every time you do big abilities, you want to do big damage, you will have to first cast a spell. This means your character needs to stand still. That is the biggest difficulty coming with casters, the standing still during certain casts obviously. This means in bigger raids, you need to time your casts properly with big spells that might otherwise hit you. This can be very difficult to execute in certain raids in endgame, so if you rather want a bit more difficulty than the physical range DPS, but you don't really like playing melee DPS, this might be your go-to choice. As a conclusion for this video, I want to quickly again mention what I believe are the perfect fits for certain roles. If you are someone that likes a lot of responsibility, that is also very clear, but otherwise a rather relaxed life in a way, I think tanking might be your thing. If on the other hand you just love to take care of your teammates and be someone that everyone's at mercy in some form or way, but still also have a lot of responsibilities, then the healer might be your choice. And if lastly, you don't really want to deal with responsibilities for now, and you just rather, enjoy your life, but you have to invest more towards the end game when playing DPS, so it will ramp up over time, trust me on that, DPS might be your thing. Please keep in mind that when playing tank, for example, your gear will carry over to any other tank. That means if you decide to start as a gladiator, you can also use the same gear on a marauder later on. That is no issue. That is something that's very comfortable and allows you to switch classes or try different jobs easier. The same applies for healers, but not necessarily for DPS. Yes, some of the DPS share the gear in between each other, besides the weapon of course, but they also have 3 or 4 different types of gear that they do not share, besides the casters who again share their gear in between each other. Anyway, that was it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, I of course really appreciate it, and I hope you learned something today. If you did, Let me know in the comments below, and also let me know what class or role are you currently playing, and are you planning on maybe changing your role or your class? I just would like to know what the new players, the new generation in Eorzea is currently leveling, so I know if I have to advertise more for tanks and healers than I already do in the next video that I will make. Don't forget to leave a like, of course, and you can also find me on Twitter. I stream also on Twitch, and you can also, of course, subscribe to my channel if you do enjoy my content. And with that note, as always, wishing you an amazing rest of your day, wherever you live.